Good afternoon. Can I welcome everyone to the 10th meeting of the Justice Subcommittee on Policing? Can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely as they interfere with the broadcasting system, even when switched to silent? No apologies have been received. Item 1, and it's the only item on the agenda, is complaints and investigations. This is the second of 3 evidence sessions on the handling of complaints and investigations under the new policing arrangements. The session will focus on the role and responsibilities of the SPA. To conclude our series on the topic, we will take evidence from the Police Investigations and Review Commission, known to us in a friendly fashion as PERC, on Thursday, 3rd October. Can I welcome to the meeting Ian Ross, Chair of Complaints and Conduct Committee, and Gillian Lafferty, Head of Complaints, Scottish Police Authority. And before I invite questions from members, I understand, Mr Ross, you wish to make a brief opening statement.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. Well, firstly, thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittee today. As the convener said, I'm Ian Ross, Board Member and Chair of the Authority's Complaints and Conduct Committee. This is my colleague Gillian Lafferty, who is the interim head of our Complaints and Conduct team. The SPA considers complaints and conduct to be a fundamental area of our work, and I want to give the committee assurances that we have taken our new responsibilities in this regard seriously. From the outset, the board of the SPA made clear we wanted to create a complaints function and supporting processes that are transparent, timely and consistent for all parties. Our approach to complaints mirrors the SPA's overarching approach to governance. It is based around early and appropriate engagement and dialogue with other statutory parties, particularly Police Scotland and the PERC, public accountability without compromising personal confidentiality, and a focus on outcomes, not just process. Good handling of complaints should enhance policing, not threaten it. We have begun to establish a coherent and professional complaints handling process and a robust reporting and scrutiny regime, both of which we recognise are integral to promoting public confidence in the system and our police service. The very first committee to be established within the SPA's government structures, and this was before the 1st of April, was the Complaints and Conduct Committee. An interim and dedicated complaints team were also in place before the 1st of April, and initial training was carried out with SPA members and staff working in this area. Work to establish appropriate policies and procedures around complaints handling and scrutiny of these processes began well in advance of the 1st of April and was led by myself. Since the 1st of April, the Complaints and Conduct Committee has met on 3 occasions, 2 of which have been in open public session. We have established policies on unacceptable behaviour, actively engaged in addressing inherited legacy complaints cases, some of which were complex and entrenched, scrutinised Police Scotland's complaints handling processes, established a memorandum of understanding with PERC, developed guidance to support senior officer regulations, and also, of course, maintain meaningful stakeholder engagement. There is still more work to be done. For example, we are working hard to refine a comprehensive performance reporting framework for both SPA and Police Scotland's complaints data, and I can give assurances to the subcommittee that we're working to get this right. I hope this goes some way to reassuring members that the SPA recognises and is working to deliver a complaint function that is fit for purpose, and I'm happy to take any questions members might have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your statement. I've got John Finney, followed by Margaret Mitchell, followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you. John. Good afternoon, panel. Mr Ross, thanks very much for the opening statement. And can I commend 2 things in particular, please? And that is the phrase you use, good handling of complaints should enhance policing, not threaten it. And also commend the practice of the open meetings. I wonder if I could touch on something, and I know you've experience of the previous systems, and I'd be interested in your views of comparisons between the 2, but particularly around an area where there's potential tension, and that is the initial assessment that's made whether a complaint merits further action. Can you give us some background to that, please?
Well, when we established our procedures, and I think the first thing to make clear is that in terms of the procedures and policies, we tried to pick up on good practice that was already there. We looked at practice that existed in terms of the legacy authorities and boards. We also very much looked at the work that the Police Complaints Commissioner had done in its previous light, sanctions to solutions and holding to account. And we also did quite a bit of informal consultation, and we produced what we call interim procedures. The reason being it's our intention to review those in the light of experience. But we think it did reflect good practice. And a feature of that is, in effect, a sort of an early assessment of a complaint when it comes in. And part of that early assessment is really to make the judgment call how it should then proceed, particularly whether it's necessary for it to proceed to investigation. Or it should be handled in another way, because it may in fact not necessarily be a complaint. It could be an HR matter, it could be something that you're seeking information, and it could in effect be a form of contact. So you know, we're acutely aware that it should be handled appropriately from the beginning, and that clearly we want to put it down the right pathway, and therefore you get a consistent approach, and an approach that is fair to the parties concerned, both the person being complained about and the person who's making the complaint.
Well, thank you for that. In the past, there was a bit of a tension seen that, or a perception that making the decision to investigate further in itself was sometimes seen as a significant escalation. And given that in the past, complaints would come in naming individual chief constable, and the potential exists that would always come in as the head, how are you able to reassure, having made that initial assessment and having decided not to go ahead, the complainer? How is that done? Is that done with a written explanation of why the initial assessment comes up with no further action?
Well, I mean, part of the process is making sure that you actually do give full and effective feedback to the complainer. And if the situation, we can only talk hypothetically, but if the situation was where in fact you made the decision not to proceed, then it would be appropriate to give a full detailed feedback to the complainer. And obviously, if you would also, as part of that, make sure that they were made aware that if they were dissatisfied with that, there were other avenues they could follow, and the avenue would be through the PERC.
And just to confirm, just because an initial assessment said that further investigation wasn't going to take place, wouldn't necessarily mean that there wouldn't be learning issues that would come out of the complaint.
Well, I'm very pleased you've raised that point, because I think that's actually a very important area. I think it's crucial that you have an approach that takes account of seeking to improve performance and to learn lessons, whether that's about processes, whether it's about points of detail in handling, whether it's about communication. And I think we're certainly very much committed to have that as central to the approach that we adopt, that we're there to make sure that we promote and establish good practice and are prepared to learn lessons. And also, in terms of complaints that come in, and it could be complaints that go to investigation, that all the way through that process there are maybe points of learning that we want to fully capture and share.
Reassuring. Thanks very much indeed.
Margaret.
Yeah. Thank you very much again for the opening statement. You'll be aware of the recent Court of Session ruling, and the nub of that really was finding against a historical case, certainly, but one where a police force was really investigating itself. Now, in view of that, do you have any concerns that the SPA deals with complaints relating to business of the SPA as a public body, including complaints about the Chief Executive, the SPA board, and individual members and SPA staff?
Well, I think the simple answer is no, but I think it's important that we go beyond that in terms of demonstrating why we are reassured. Clearly, in terms of the way we operate within legislation and regulations, and in terms of the legislation and regulations, they're new, they're recent, and they themselves have gone through a process to make sure that hopefully there's full compliance with a number of issues, particularly around DHCR. In terms of separation of handling, I suppose that any organisation, be it private or public, has to deal with complaints. So there's nothing unusual, I think, inherently about an organisation dealing with complaints against itself or against its members or against its policies. It's how they then handles those complaints. So in terms of the SPA, a number of the things that we do, well, first of all, we have a separate and committed complaints and conduct team, which is led by Gillian. We also have, in terms of the Complaints and Conduct Committee, we have a dedicated committee, again with training to support its activities, and it also has a degree of separation. So it could be that people involved in other activities or people involved at a senior level as officers, there would be, in effect, a form of, I suppose, a sterile corridor that exists between them, and it's important to maintain that. And I think the other critical thing is that we also, of course, have the opportunity in terms of investigation to make use of an independent investigator, whether it's the PERC or it could be, if it was more appropriate, it could be someone else. But in general, I mean, we're very fortunate that we now do have the PERC, and as an organisation, we make use of the PERC, and there's been a number of points that we have referred to the PERC, and you know, that has worked very efficiently and effectively.
And would the same go for, but you're co-locating sometimes with Police Scotland and personnel from Police Scotland, so no concerns about possibly monitoring and looking at the complaint handling arrangements, given that you have to work so closely together, you do forge a relationship?
Well, I mean, I think there is probably less and less of co-location, but I think there probably is still some, but it is fairly limited and will become less. But in terms of the complaints handling team, you know, that is actually identified as a separate and secure area. In fact, perhaps my colleague Julian may want to actually just describe how that's handled, because we felt that that was critical, that there was physical separation and there was limits in terms of access. Not that we anticipated problems, but we wanted to make sure that reassurance was in place.
Yes, thank you. We do certainly have our own processes, and we have very clear, as Ian's pointed out, we do have very clear corridors and separations of when complaints are considered, particularly about members of staff. We've undertaken a lot of internal engagement so far, particularly with colleagues in HR, and we work closely with professional standards to ensure that our boundaries and respective roles are clear and, shall we say, word I'm looking for. Distinct, thank you. And where there are any areas that may need further discussion or investigation, then we have very clear boundaries as to how that process materialises. As Ian also pointed out, the Complaints and Conduct Committee are a referral point, for example, within my own team, where we've considered a complaint and perhaps come to a conclusion or recommendation, then ultimately it's a decision for the Complaints and Conduct Committee to consider further before any final decision is made.
And just to add to that, just as mentioned about the physical separation, I mean, the Complaints and Conduct team actually operate within a physically secure environment. I can't walk into their room. I have to be allowed into their room, and they occasionally let me in, which I obviously appreciate.
Thank you for that.
Allowed occasionally in is the interesting question there.
I can tell you it's completely above.
It's a very general response. We won't press to any further. Margaret, is that you finished for the time being? I've got Kevin followed by Alison and then got Graham.
Thank you, Convener. You mentioned in your opening statement about legacy cases, and I'd like to touch upon that, if I may. Obviously, having served on a board but not the complaints subcommittee, but having seen minutes from that on a regular basis, we often have persistent complainers. I'm quite sure that you as a new body will have found that you've had cases which have gone way back in the past where somebody has decided to come to you, and maybe you can go into some detail in that. How are you going to deal with these persistent complainers? Do you have a plan of action in terms of talking to these folks face to face, which often resolve some of the difficulties rather than probably the poor practice that went on in some places before, where folks were written to or telephoned, which didn't really get to the nub of the difficulties that they had? I wonder if you could go into some detail on that, please.
Well, I think first of all, just in terms of legacy cases, I think it's important to note, yes, there may be some which fall into perhaps the characteristics that you've used, but there also clearly were legacy complaints which were ongoing complaints that on the 1st of April transferred to us, and we were dealing with them as would be appropriate. But if we're talking about complaints where perhaps there was a degree of persistence, I think the important thing is that you deal with that in an honest and fair and consistent manner. Just because someone is a persistent complainer doesn't mean that they don't have a valid complaint. So that you know, the procedures are there to actually deal with that. In the sense, we look at the complaint, we look at the detail of the complaint, the heads of complaint, the allegations, and then we would just deal and process that as before. If it was a complaint, in effect, was recycling something that had been dealt with before, you know, in effect, it was a complaint that had been raised and had been appropriately dealt with, perhaps sometimes even was the subject of a referral to the previous body, the PCCS, and had a complaint handling review, then we make reference to that. And you know, the response would be clear and objective. Where perhaps there is some difficulty with a complainer and the nature of their complaints, and that, first of all, that would not in any way affect the fact that we would still deal with it as an appropriate complaint, and that's the critical thing, then what we have in place is we have something called an unacceptable actions policy. And that's something that, in fact, was very recently agreed by the committee, and we made use of good practice elsewhere. And as we've done within a number of areas, we've talked to people like the Scottish Public Sector Ombudsman, and we've engaged with him and other organisations, looked at examples of good practice and how you would deal with certain situations. So that's a new policy that, in fact, we've just adopted. And in terms of the specifics of how you would deal with an individual, I think that probably would be influenced by the differing circumstances, and you would try to make sure that the approach was appropriate for those circumstances.
Thank you. I'd like to follow on, because you've mentioned unacceptable actions policy, and coming across one of those policies in a different body in recent times, when that is implemented and an individual is told that it is being implemented, that can often be much more antagonistic and can cause even greater grief. How are you going to convey to a persistent complainer that you are going to use your unacceptable actions policy? Is that going to be face-to-face, or is that going to be...
I suppose I'm trying to suggest that I don't think there is one size fits all. And I think it would depend on the individual circumstance. I'm very happy to actually share the policy with you, and I'll send it to the clerk of the committee so you can actually you can examine it and see the basis of the approach that we've adopted. I would never suggest that we would not meet someone face to face, but at the same time I think I'll be hesitant to say that would be automatically something that we would do, because in the way that you describe that it actually might resolve a problem, sometimes it can perhaps have the opposite effect. So I think it's important to have a little bit of discretion in terms of what is the appropriate way to deal with a set of circumstances. I'd also emphasise that we don't just suddenly rush to implement an unacceptable actions policy. I see that as being something that's probably significantly down the road, but I think it's also there to be fair to all parties. It's not there to anyway identify individuals and label them in an inappropriate way.
So would it be fair to say that common sense will come into play?
Well, I always like to think that common sense has an important part to play.
Fan of common sense, but it's sadly lacking in certain quarters. But I wish you all the best in that regard. One of the other things, Convener...
Can I just do a supplementary to your legacy? I'm noting that complaints raising allegations, simply allegations of criminal behaviour past the Crown Office and the PF's office. In the legacy of those, how many did you inherit that are with the Crown Office? How many with the PF's office? And how many also are sort of in train? And I suppose what I'd also like to know is if we're going on, maybe malicious complaints that have to be investigated of criminal behaviour by an officer or otherwise, if you can't tell me this, but I'd like the information, how many of these turn out to be unfounded when an officer is being, maligned and in fact almost, I suppose, suspended during all that? I'd be interested to know if you have these figures.
Well, we have some of those figures with us, and I'll ask my colleague Gillian to summarise that. She's much more familiar with them than I am. But just in general terms, I'd make the point that where there is any complaint that has an inference of criminality, our automatic response is to at least pass that on.
Could you just for me define inference of criminality? I mean, what would be the lowest thing that could be alleged that would make you use that expression, inference of criminality?
If someone made an allegation and that allegation would be considered to be a criminal act, then we would pass that on to the Crown Office.
Well, that's pretty low level, actually. Anything could be right down to breach of the peace, or is this in or out of uniform as well?
I think if there was an implication that it was breaking the law, we would pass that on to the Crown Office. They're in a much better position to make a judgment on that than
I
us.
appreciate that. What I'm getting at is just trying to get the figures. It just popped into my head when my colleague was talking about maybe mischievous and persistent and malicious.
Well, I think that's a point where perhaps Gillian can give a summary of the figures. I don't know if we can necessarily give you all the figures now, but we'll endeavour to give you if there's any that are outstanding.
Be useful.
We inherited 17 complaints from former boards and police authorities. Of that 17 to date, we've closed down 4, with a further 3 awaiting consideration by the next Complaints and Conduct Committee. We have a further 2 cases currently being considered by the Police Independent Review Commissioner and 1 case with the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, which is currently being considered. We don't have the outcome of that consideration yet. It's in very early stages, but we'd be happy to provide further detail to you when that's in receipt.
What would also be useful, maybe, may I just, and I realise it's not asking how long is a piece of string, but obviously if somebody has some allegation like that hanging over them, speed in the, but also balance the interest of us is of the essence. How long do these sort of take? Are they slow or are they expedited or what?
I can't speak for other organisations, but our aim would always be to move things through the process as quickly as
I
swiftly as
appreciate
possible.
your aims. Everybody would have those aims. So
Yes.
what are the facts? What's been
At the moment, we acknowledge complaints, or our aim is to acknowledge complaints and contact with our office within 3 days.
No, I'm talking
Sorry.
about the criminal. I'm talking
Criminal,
about
sorry, I
process.
beg
I'm
your
sorry, I'm
pardon.
not being clear
I think
enough.
if I could come in there,
Yes.
I don't think we are able to answer that. In terms of the position with ourselves, if I heard the statistics right, I think there is 1 that is currently with the Crown Office. But just to make the point, in terms of the direct complaints that we manage and handle and have a full responsibility for, those are complaints against senior officers. We also have a responsibility in terms of clearly complaints against the SPA and SPA staff. But we have a scrutiny role in terms of scrutinising the way in which Police Scotland, through their professional standards teams, actually handle complaints. And certainly there are statistics as part of the data that's made available to us, which would give a summary of some of those points. But in terms of criminal allegations against police officers below the rank of ACC, then that would be dealt with in terms of the management of it by Police Scotland through the professional
I
standards
appreciate
team.
that. So but you can give us the other stuff to do with the senior ranks,
That's
which
right,
is
and that
of
was
interest.
and that was the statistics, which I think there was 1 that was currently with the Crown Office.
Thank you. Because if you really wanted to, I mean, you could have genuine allegations, but if you really wanted to cause trouble, you could make an allegation that might be quite hard for a senior officer over a long period. I'm not taking sides, but you know, obviously.
I think hypothetically that is possible, and I think if we encountered that situation, then we would seek to manage that appropriately. We have not as yet encountered that in terms of since the 1st of April.
Right, sorry about that, Kidney.
That's okay. I've just got one other point, Convener, and that's round about the local policing scrutiny bodies and their role in all of this. And we're told that that they will still get the statistics and the number and nature of complaints in particular local areas under the auspices of the 2012 Act. But there seems to have been a little bit of a spat with Fife Council Police Transition Committee round about looking at a closed case, I think it was. Can you maybe go into detail on that? And do you think it's wise for local bodies to hark back to closed cases?
Well, I think a little bit of context here might be useful in the sense that under the legacy situation with police boards and police authorities, it was not unusual. In fact, it was recommended that probably the complaints committees or complaints working groups would carry out some form of dip sampling where they would look at closed cases. But the intention was it was part of the wider scrutiny role to, I suppose, to get a full understanding of how a complaint had been handled. And I think there is some merit in that. The situation with Fife, as I understand it, and I know it's been suggested that the SPA had said that that should not happen. Can I just make it clear that at no stage did SPA make any statement to that effect? We're not in a position to. It's not something that we have control over. I, in fact, am aware that Fife councillors have raised this. I've been involved in a response to them, and I actually have agreed to meet them, and will be meeting representatives from Fife Council within the next 10 days. I think there is the potential for added value to come from local scrutiny. I think that we as an organisation, the SPA, will actually carry out a degree of it, but clearly we're not in a position in terms of the resourcing to do perhaps what had existed before. So I think we're very keen to explore how we can add value through working with local scrutiny committees. But I think there are issues that have to be resolved because the landscape has changed, the legal and other forms of landscape has changed, particularly when you start doing any form of sampling or dip sampling with closed cases. And certainly I know that Police Scotland and SPA we're keen to explore how we can perhaps see how that might be taken forward. But there are issues that need to be resolved, particularly around, I suppose, the way in which it's carried out, appropriate confidentiality and data management. In terms of the 2012 Act, as you quite rightly say, there is an absolute commitment to data being made available, and I think that's very important. I think the question is how we can go beyond that, and as I say, that's what we're exploring, and I'm sure that the meeting I had with Fife in just over a week's time will hopefully help contribute to that.
Convener.
And Alison, followed by Graham, please.
Thank you. My question relates to your role in the SPA's responsibility for the oversight of the police services handling of their complaints. And I refer to a paper that was in front of your committee on the 22nd of August, where it was reported to you that the recording processes were changing, and that following the creation of the Police Service of Scotland, it was the intention of the business area to implement recording off-duty criminal incidents as prosecution reports instead of criminal complaints, and the recording of off-duty instances of officers or members of staff being issued fixed penalty notices or conditional officers as miscellaneous instead of a complaint. And I'd be interested to understand what discussion you had round about those changes and what the effect of those changes will be. Will that be to take, as it were, numbers out of the complaint system and therefore perhaps artificially change the figures?
I think there certainly have been some issues, I think, with some of the legacy forces, that there was a slightly different approach that was adopted. And I know that Police Scotland are committed to make sure that there is an absolutely consistent approach that's adopted, so that if you are looking at data, the data actually means the same. In terms of the specific question you've asked, I think I would probably have to come back to you with a little bit more detail. I'm not sure. I don't remember the level of the level of discussion, particularly on that point. But I do remember the discussion about ensuring that all areas and all divisions adopted a consistent approach that reflected what was agreed. And my recollection of someone who had actually been a member of a legacy complaints committee was that some of these changes actually came into being probably about 2 or 3 years ago. And I don't think necessarily all forces implemented them in quite the same way. So I think that's actually the connection. But can I just qualify that I just want to maybe confirm that I'm being accurate and not misleading you in any way.
That would be helpful if you could come back, because I think it is important, however minor the offences are, to be able to identify if police officers have carried out those offences. So I wouldn't like these figures to be obscured by under some sort of miscellaneous column.
Thank you very much. Graham.
Thanks, Convener. Good afternoon. I think there was a number of areas that I wanted to cover with you and start with the legacy transfer to begin with. Could you explain to us how that transfer was achieved? Is it the case that the authority looked at each individual case, satisfied themselves that the content of that case, and thereafter felt that they had taken responsibility to conclude that case, having been satisfied that it was appropriate for you in the first place? Did you go through each case individually?
Well, prior to the 1st of April, one of the exercises that we carried out was to make sure that we were beginning to get an understanding of quite what was out there. And we engaged with all of the legacy boards and authorities to begin to capture that. And I mean, in general, people were extremely helpful. There were 1 or 2 issues, but that was probably more about sort of staff changes. But we wanted to ensure that we could actually make sure that we had access to all of the information, and we knew precisely how far a case had progressed, particularly in terms of the appropriate regulations. We also did a bit of liaising with other bodies who would have a similar interest, particularly the PERC, well, PCCS as was. And it wasn't in any way a negotiation over cases, and more about just making sure that our understanding of what was out there was the same as their understanding.
Sure.
And the critical thing was, of course, on the 1st of April, we were the responsible body, irrespective of who had been involved before. And in some cases, clearly, things were at a particular stage in a process, and in general terms, we would just take it on from that point. I think it's also fair to say that we also felt it was important that we had a full understanding of all the cases, and certainly a large part of Gillian's work and her team was really just to make sure that they had a familiarity with an enormous amount of work. And you know, I'm full of admiration for the work that Gillian and her team have done in terms of coming to terms with that, because you know, clearly you were dealing, it may have been, I think 17 was the quoted figure, but I mean there is an enormous amount of material associated with that. And in fact, Gillian may want to make some additional comments, but certainly I think that at an early stage into the existence of SPA, you know, we had, I wouldn't call it an assessment, we had maybe taken stock, and then we were in a position to judge how things should then continue. But clearly, we were also obliged, of course, to work within the regulations.
Of course.
And that includes some of the transitional regulations, and it's absolutely vital that we're seen and if scrutinised, that we're seen to actually make sure that we do deliver on that.
Yeah, I think the point of my question was that you've had the opportunity, there's always, I suppose, a threat that someone could delay dealing with something knowing that the authority was coming along, and you end up being passed a case which is unsuitable, shall I say, for further handling. But at least you've had the opportunity to look at the work that's been done in the 8 different forces, and the responsibilities you've now accepted would seem to indicate that you're dealing with a case that should be dealt with and needs to be taken further on into the process. You're not going to come back to us in a year's time and say, this should never have been passed to us in the first place. That would have been identified by this time.
Well, I think we obviously respect the work that the legacy bodies have done, and I think that is justified. Our commitment, and I think it's demonstrated by the stats that Gillian has quoted, is that we have, right from the 1st of April, we've been committed to moving forward and processing the cases in an appropriate way, a consistent way, and one that's fair to all parties. And the fact that I think 4 have been closed, I think 3 are at an advanced stage in terms of moving towards closure, and in some cases we've also dealt with a number of the allegations, although the cases haven't themselves necessarily been closed. So I think we've been very efficient in terms of doing that, and I would emphasise that some of these cases were complicated and entrenched, I think is a phrase I've used earlier, and they very much were, and did go back a considerable period of time. But that was done in line with regulations and based on a full assessment and stock take of the information that was made available to us.
Okay, thanks for that. The other point I wanted some clarity on was that we understand you have senior officers that are subject of the regulations, which is Assistant Chief Constable and above. You have non-senior below that level, which are dealt with within the complaints and professional standards environment. And then you have staff, most of whom will be employed through the authority. Those senior members of staff who are at executive level, can you indicate whether or not they would be treated in a separate process in the way that executive members of the police service will be, or will they be dealt with within a process which is coterminous with other staff members, if I can put it that way?
Well, I mean, first of all, when we're talking about police staff, clearly there are police staff and there are SPA staff. So, and the vast majority of civilian staff will be police staff and will work within Police Scotland.
Indeed. And
will be responsible to the Chief Constable. SPA staff, that is an area where we do have responsibility, and we would deal with, well, first of all, they're not subject to the police regulations or the senior officer regulations, so they would be dealt with in line with normal HR and conduct management. And if it is a complaint, as opposed to an HR issue, then it would be dealt with through complaints and conduct. I mean, there would be no difference of standards. I mean, I think it's important there's a consistent standard and a transparent standard in terms of the way in which you would carry out a pre-assessment or, if appropriate, carry out an investigation.
I'm grateful for that. It's useful for the record so that people understand externally. Staying on that point, therefore, within Police Scotland, there are staff members who are part of the executive board, who will be head of HR, head of personnel, and perhaps some other posts. The others who would sit round that table with them would be senior officers in terms of the regulations. If there is a difficulty, and hopefully it would never occur, but if there is a difficulty about complaints procedure for a staff member at that level, would you expect that that would be handled internally by the Chief Constable, or would that become something that would be remitted to the police authority to deal with?
Well, you're right. As far as I'm aware, I don't think any situation such as that has arisen. I think there is a decision that does have to be made in terms of how you handle a case. What is not unusual, and again, I'm talking hypothetically now, I'd emphasise that where you are dealing with, say, a senior member of staff, you would probably make a judgment whether that's something that should be subject to an investigation. And if it was subject to an investigation, would it be appropriate to be handled internally, or would you bring someone from outside? And I think the answer to those situations, in different situations, could be yes, you could handle it internally, but in some other circumstances, just to get that separation, to make sure that even from a perception perspective rather than a real perspective, there is a benefit in actually having it handled externally. But if it was a member of police staff, then that would be a decision clearly for the Chief Constable, and I'm sure he would apply good sense, as he consistently does, and I would have no doubt of that. What I would say, though, and what would be appropriate, and I'm sure would happen, is that's an issue that we would look at in terms of just our wider scrutiny of complaints.
You're taking me on to my next question now.
And I think it's often forgotten that we, as an SPA, have that important role of scrutinising the way in which Police Scotland carry out their handling of complaints. And to be fair to Police Scotland, they have been very cooperative in terms of assisting us where we've wanted, particularly whether it's additional information, perhaps to try and make things as open and as public as possible, and to make sure that we've got full access. There's never been any difficulties there. In fact, you know, they've been extremely open. And of course, over and above that, clearly you've got the role of PERC, and PERC, if the Commissioner wished, could engage in that, and does carry out a general audit role of the way in which Police Scotland carry out complaints. So there's a number of independent elements that could come into play.
Yeah, I'm conscious of that, and we have discussed that on the committee at previous occasions. And you've acknowledged in your first contribution to our meeting today that this is a new responsibility, and I understand there's a learning process involved in coming to terms with this new landscape. So that oversight of the internal procedures of Police Scotland, could you give us some indication of how that will operate, how effective you think that review and scrutiny will work? What will be the process that you understand just now? Are you still moving to understand how you'll do that? Well,
I think there are some things that are in place. I mean, and part of that is just having access to a comprehensive set of statistics, and also the extent to which the statistics can be made available to the public. And we've had some very productive discussions with Police Scotland about that. We want to take as much in public as we can, but clearly we don't want... There are certain areas where it would compromise confidentiality, or there may be another set of problems. So it's about trying to get that balance. But over and above that, I mean, two additional areas that, although we haven't started in this yet, we've had discussions about how we would take it forward. There's almost like I suppose it's a form of audit process, but it's audit related to complaints, where you will perhaps look at a particular topic or look at a particular area, carry out a visit, gather information, and carry out scrutiny on that. And I would emphasise some of that actually might be very positive. You know, it's about identifying, recognising, acknowledging good practice. It's important that this isn't seen as uniquely something that's about negativity. There's a lot of good practice out there that you want to identify and share as well. So, you know, that's another part of it. And a third part, which maybe slightly overlaps, is the geographical aspect, and it slightly links into a previous question. It's important, you know, that we're able to get a feel for what's happening across Scotland. You know, it might be, for instance, looking at detail over some aspects of complaint handling or the trends in complaints in a particular divisional area. And it would be our intention to do that. Just in terms of the timeline, we haven't quite got there yet, but it's something that we would hope to do. You know, I would certainly hope to begin to look at least one division before the end of our first financial year.
Yeah, I welcome all that you've said there in that response, and I would reiterate, I think from my perspective, the importance that the public would place at the effectiveness of that scrutiny. What I wonder, and it goes back, I think, to one of the first questions from Mr. Finney, is this element of assessment, and the assessment that the internal processes make of the nature of a complaint, and it's the ability of that scrutiny exercise to ensure that the appropriate assessments are done at that very early stage. Given this changed landscape, all these new responsibilities, and a very complex relationship that you'll have with these various agencies, you feel that your committee will have both the capacity and the time to be able to reach down into the professional standards environment to ensure good health in that regard. And I suppose, and this is a side issue but connected, will you have the vetting which will allow you to enter through doors that otherwise might be placed before you in ensuring proper scrutiny?
Well, just maybe starting with that last point, all of the board members have had a level of vetting. That was a requirement before they could take up their posts. And certainly in the area of complaints and in other areas, Police Scotland have certainly been very helpful and not in any way obstructive in terms of access to information. And as far as the commitment of time, that's why I was very keen to make that point in my introductory remarks. I mean, there is a very real commitment by the SPA to this area of work, because we think it's important in itself, it's important in terms of public confidence, it's important in terms of hopefully giving reassurance to, for instance, this committee. It's vital that we're able to do that, we're able to robustly demonstrate that. There are some things that we have yet to do. There is a timeline. But I think in terms of the initial work and the engagement that has supported that work, I think it for me is very reassuring and positive. In terms of the assessment and the judgment, I think an important part of that is both the expertise and the professionalism that our officer team has. And in terms of the team, well, someone such as Gillian actually comes from many years of experience of operating within, whether it's PCCS or the Public Sector Ombudsman. And so it's important that people have that threshold of relevant transferable expertise. And I think that's also reflected in terms of the people that are members of the Complaints and Contact Committee. There are people that, one is a judicial reviewer, there's a number that have worked within the legal profession, particularly within the Procurator Fiscal Service, and are accustomed to dealing with a range of complaint and other related matters. I myself chaired a complaints committee for 5 years and have been a member of a police complaints committee for probably about 8 or 9 years. But over and above that, a commitment to performance improvement and training. We've had training, we will have further training, and training will be ongoing, including contributions from stakeholder partners. And we have very regular contact with some of our key stakeholders, whether that's Police Scotland, PERC, the Crown Office and others.
Can
I just ask you something, because I don't know this, and it's probably a very stupid question, but that's prefaced it, so that gets me out of the ditch. Does your oversight of Police Scotland's handling of complaints embrace complaints by police against other police?
Yes. First of all, I don't think chairs ever ask stupid questions.
You're so sweet, but they do. Now, I have to tell you, I wouldn't let Alex Salmond flatter me, so you have no prospect. Seriously, it does cover that.
It does, and there have been incidences where we have dealt with complaints of that nature.
And that ties into what was being asked by my colleague Graham Pearson about assessments, and then also into what you said about a trend in complaints in an area. Let's take a hypothetical when a particular part of Scotland, some division of the police, has a high number of complaints by police against other police of alleged, let's say, criminal activity or something or other. You could get into that.
Yes, and also the PERC could get into that as well. I mean, I think one of the things that we're very keen to have in terms of the stats and the data that's made available to us to see if there are any trends. And I think it's very important to have mechanisms that can identify trends, because that can then be an indicator that you need to delve a bit more deeply into that. I mean, I think one of the things that we've probably got to be aware of is, and it hasn't necessarily been tested, but clearly there might be areas where the PERC would want to look at something, and if we were wanting to look at it at the same time, I think we probably would have to give appropriate respect to the position that the PERC has. But yes, you know, I think...
Is that a change from before? I don't know. Is this help? Is this helpful, the SPA being there now, sort of out of the police frame, as it were?
Well, I think one of the very significant changes in terms of the new arrangements and reform is that an issue of capacity and expertise and the ability to sort of commit resources. It might have just been possible with one of the legacy forces, but it's probably quite challenging there. With SPA, we have a dedicated complaints team. Right. That is their job. We have clearly the PCCS with an additional investigation role to becoming PERC, And I think in terms of the members of the complaints committee, I mean, I think there was probably some very fine complaints working groups and committees out there, but in terms of the commitment of time and expertise, I think it's unlikely that anyone would have been able to match that purely because of just natural circumstances. So I
Because you
think
can see
that
where I'm going. It could be that there's mischief afoot between a personal thing going on somewhere. And I mean, this is purely hypothetical, but there could be mischief afoot by one colleague saying something against another colleague and so on. And then it just gets lost somewhere in the mass. But we've now got something, you're telling me, that yourself and the SP independently, because this is different from what's happening elsewhere in Scotland. The smell's different, feels different, whatever we look at it. Would that be what I'm putting in colloquial terms, as chairs may do occasionally?
in terms of capability and capacity and expertise, I think that is now significantly greater.
Right, that's interesting. Sorry, Graham.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no problem. The I've only got two final questions. One for Jolyon, but one for yourself, Mr. Eros. You mentioned that in this question about independence of investigation, that my colleague Margaret Mitchell asked you about, that the PERC quite properly could come in and there's an element of independence in the way that they would investigate a complaint against an officer within Police Scotland. And then you said, could be someone else. Was that just a turn of phrase, or did you actually mean that you had in mind that there could be someone else who could operate in that regard, and who would that be?
I'll give you a couple of examples. I think in general, if we were dealing with a senior officer, that you would be obliged to refer it to the PERC. And sure. I don't think there's anyone else that we would wish to refer it to. There may be some circumstances where the PERC decides not to continue with an investigation. If we felt there was a need still to investigate, that maybe there was a wider learning point, maybe it was an issue around just that it just didn't fit the regulations, then there might be, and I think it would be in extreme circumstances, but there might be where you might say, well, we would see if there was another way of investigating or investigating some part of it. And so that you would probably look, if you wanted something independent, you would then look at what else was available out there. I think the reference that I made there probably was to do with circumstances where it wasn't a police officer and you were looking for a degree of independence to investigate a matter out with the normal police regulations.
The reason for my question was in the previous regime, it could be perceived that by sending to another police force in Scotland, you had an element of independence and you were able to some extent, to deal with the issue. Now that we have a single police force, that opportunity is no longer available, and I wondered if you thought of external to Scotland, you would seek advice elsewhere when you mentioned someone else, or did you?
I think it's one of these loose terms that I wish I hadn't used at the time.
Fine. I thought it might be, but I wanted just to clarify it. Now, finally, and hopefully not a difficult time, the complaints team that has been alluded to, can you give us some indication of the size of that complaints team? And a notion, are they vetted and how will they operate in reality?
We have 2 additional complaints officers working alongside myself, both vetted to the relevant standard for their post. And
can I just thought, what does that mean, relevant standard?
Well, my understanding is there are various levels of vetting.
There is.
And
do you know what you're vetted to?
As far as I'm aware, recruitment vetting, I think.
Okay.
I can't be certain at the moment.
So in terms of security vetting at
yes.
the senior level, you're not DV develop vetted?
No, I'm not. Personally, no, I'm not. The members of staff we have a wealth of experience in
develop vetted.
All right, okay. Just
that security vetting that allows access to
we didn't quite catch it here,
sensitive
so
documents and so forth.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Sorry, my 2 members of staff are experienced members of staff in both administrative processes and risk and assurance, and bring different dynamics to the team. Sure. They've undertaken training alongside members of the board and Complaints and Conduct Committee, and are continuing to undertake further training in a number of areas that relate to complaints processes and, for example, Freedom of Information, Data Protection Act legislation, and we also are able to draw quite extensively and experience within the organisation from our legal partners and colleagues, and as I say, from the information management team.
Now, from the background that was explained to us earlier, you come to it not a stranger to the issues that you're going to face. Presumably your two colleagues will be in a similar situation, that their background is such that they bring that experience into the authority?
They do bring different aspects of experience, but also will undertake ongoing training, as I say, and be to a level, and they also have myself as a resource, as they do members of the Complaints and Conduct team. So it's a work in progress, and we are progressing very well. I'm very pleased with the status we're at so far.
Okay. You mentioned that there were 17 cases that you took from the legacy, and I think you outlined what had happened to 7 of them. Are the other 10 just business in progress currently?
Yes,
and operating through the system?
Yeah, what I should have perhaps made a bit clearer was that 4 are closed, 3 are nearing conclusion, 2 have been referred to the park, and 1 is with the Crown Office. So
thank goodness
10.
You said the same numbers yet again.
Yeah, well that's 10 cases that are being dealt with. 7 cases of that 17 remain ongoing and continue to be a work in progress.
7, that's
yes.
good. That's helpful. And do you feel that the size of your team, that's sufficient for the volume of work that you are currently progressing and that you anticipate you will face in the coming years?
Yes, so far I can say with confidence that we're working through at a very steady pace. I'm pleased with the progress so far that we've made in closing the legacy cases. We are and continue to receive complaints of a different nature, not just about senior officers but members of staff and other organisations that we're dealing with on a daily basis. So we're managing very successfully to progress that work timelessly.
Can I just add?
If there was, I just could ask if there was a complaint against either of you, or indeed the Chief Executive, how would that be dealt with? I mean, it's a proper question to ask. How would that be dealt with? Who polices the polices that were, who guards the guards?
Well, I think we work on the principle that that could happen. And I think when if there was a complaint against myself, for instance, then I think that you would ensure that there would be the appropriate separation and independence. And if anyone was felt to be conflicted, either, well, clearly I would be, but even by association, then you would make arrangements to actually address that. And that could very well be that some people would not be part of the investigation. I mean, it actually links slightly back to Mr. Pearson's point when I made my loose remark. I think that one of the benefits of perhaps looking for someone external is that it actually can be used as a means of actually addressing a potential conflict that might exist because of who the complaint is aimed against or the circumstances of that complaint. I was just going to make one additional comment.
I'm sorry, just to go on, because it would mean not necessarily be a complaint against you, but it might be something you'd have to declare an interest for having been part at some point in the process. Are you saying you've already got plans and you've all got thoughts in place to have somebody else independent out with the SPA to deal with these? You've already got some thoughts on this.
No, we haven't identified anyone because I think that would depend on the circumstances. But what we have done is we've recognised that that type of situation would arise, and that there is a procedure in place in terms of people would declare an interest, and we've already had that. We actually had members that have withdrawn from the complaints committee because they felt that there was the potential, even the perception, that they might have a conflict. And so that's well established, and it's reflected, in fact, in the way in which the agenda and the meetings are managed.
I'm sorry, you wanted to.
It was really just in terms of the size of the complaints team, because right at the beginning, I mean, we didn't necessarily know what team we would need at month 6, month 9, month 12, but we wanted to put in place what we thought was a robust team, but it was always accepted that we would review in the light of experience, and that there was a preparedness that resources would be made available to ensure that we had the team that actually could deliver the work that was required.
I understand it right. Presumably, although it's a complaints team, they aren't of themselves investigators. It's about ensuring an executive oversight on behalf of the committee and almost an insurance policy to ensure that those who are functioned as investigators and reporters have fulfilled their responsibilities fully. That's basically what your team members will be involved in.
Their primary role is there to manage the investigation process, but I would emphasise that they also have expertise in terms of looking at, for instance, investigation reports.
Well, I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that. And, you know, from my own point of view, I welcome what's been said today, and I think the function that you perform within this new authority is absolutely critical if one's to have confidence in the new National Police Force.
I think it's also, would it be fair to comment that I appreciate you're looking at process sometimes, but you can't sometimes take separate process and substance because they become interlocked. So that you might be looking at police handling of complaints, say, and getting into the substance of it at times, because that's part of it as well as the time it took or how it was done. But that may be part of also the substance of whether it was handled properly or otherwise, or a proper complaint in the first place. Would that be a fair comment?
I think when you're looking and scrutinising, I would hope that there's not really an area which is a no-go area. I mean, there's areas where we don't have a legal responsibility, but I think there's an acceptance in terms of constructive challenge and comment that that is expected and would be part of the way we would operate.
Do you want to ask something, Kevin? You're taking a funny breath. No, sorry, Graham.
No, I'm just...
It was just a funny breath, yes. He was computing in his head.
A lot's been said about the development of the National Police Force and the legislation that lies behind it in the last year. You two now are at the sharp end of all this and have been given the responsibilities from all these arrangements and practical mandates and protocols that you've now decided. Do you feel that you're now in a proper position to deliver on the responsibilities that people like us expect you to fulfil? Or do you look at what we've done and have a sadness that we overlooked some part of this? Have we armed you properly for the duties that you need to perform?
I think in terms of the Act as it applies to complaints and complaint management, I'm very content with the provisions, and that includes clearly the creation of PERC and also the powers and roles that we have. I think there was a question raised about local scrutiny, and I think there's provision there in terms of access to data. We have to be a little bit creative in terms of how we manage something that, because I think there is something that can add value there in terms of the involvement of local scrutiny committees, but we must make sure that we do that in a way that doesn't fall foul of the Act. I think that can be done, but we've got to do a little bit more work around that.
I've got to say that it's probably something that we haven't covered with a great deal of energy this lunchtime, but that ability of your committee to give confidence to local communities that things are truly happening will be very significant for the future, because if local oversight isn't confirmed in that regard, then we'll end up in a disconnect between what you think you're achieving at national level and what local communities actually believe is, goodness forbid, but a corrupt organisation overseeing the local communities. That's what you need to bridge in terms of confidence.
Can I make what I think is an important point? I mean, right at the beginning, and this goes beyond complaints and conduct, we were very keen to ensure that we weren't seen as a centralist body, and there's an understandable reason why we might do that. And part of that is clearly just the way in which we conduct our business, but it's also the way in which we engage with particularly local authorities but other partners. Every local authority will have at least one board member that will engage with them, and in some cases that also includes community planning partnerships. I sit on 2 community planning partnerships. I'm primary point of contact for Orkney, Shetland and the Highlands, and my colleagues do a similar role across Scotland. And it's vital, that is an effective role, and clearly part of that would involve, for instance, complaints and conduct matters.
Thank you.
Can I say that? Thank you very much. I'm going to bring this to a conclusion now, but I think that's very useful because we'll hopefully be discussing our work programme at the next meeting, and that will be after we've done, I think it's one more on complaints procedure. We're then going on to look at local policing, so it's not just delivery on the streets, but also the complaints procedure interaction with the public and so on. I thank you both very much for your attendance at the meeting. Not at all, thank you. Now, so we've got the Police Investigation Review Commission before the subcommittee at our next meeting, 3rd of October, and as I've already said, we'll also consider our work programme, which really, I think, flows on. You made a good choice to take it this way around, because it then moves on to local policing. Right, thank you very much. I close the meeting. Thank you.